welcome to a brand new episode of Seize the Moment podcast. And today we have a very special guest. We have Mike McIntire. He's an investigative reporter, author, and editor. As a member of the investigations unit at the New York Times, he shared Pulitzer Prizes in 2022 for reporting on the hidden financial incentives behind police traffic stops, and in 2017 for reporting on covert Russian interference in the US presidential election. And his new book, available July 21st, is called Ricochet: Guns, Greed, and the American Way of Violence. Mike, it's such a pleasure to have you on, and thanks for being with us here today.
No, thanks for the invitation. It's great to be with you guys.
Absolutely. So in the book, Mike wrote, I've spent a big part of my career as a journalist writing about gun violence. I've also tried to investigate the larger forces at work. It's clear, for instance, that reckless commercial practices, making firearms nearly as easy to acquire as an iPhone, have contributed to the problem. In the modern era, a veritable witch's brew of money, politics, and ideology has warped gun rights, opening the door to irresponsible marketing and accessibility of powerful weapons. But to lay blame solely with the selfish, craven, or deluded would be to miss the larger point. They are all responding to something embedded deep in the American psyche. So what I love so much about your work is you cover so many facets of it, of pretty much gun violence and the issue of gun violence. And I think for a lot of us, we look at this mainly as a political issue, and we mainly look at it as just an issue of greed in an organization, the NRA in particular, trying to survive. But it's so much deeper than that. So, and it's what I love about this is because there's so many facets of it, it's even kind of hard to know where to start. But from my perspective, just because I am a psychotherapist, I like to start from the perspective of the psyche, right? What is it that he actually makes us so what makes us so I guess kind of what makes guns feel so irresistible to us, right? So what makes it so that like these weapons and these sort of killing forces, or these forces that kind of annihilate people, what makes them so attractive to most people or many people?
Yeah, I mean, it is a really good question because one of the goals of my book was to kind of go beyond just the usual debates about the Second Amendment and the NRA and the gun industry and kind of get to the roots of some of what America's experience has been with this. And I think that part of that involves going back to before the founding of the country. I mean, guns have been sort of part of the wallpaper of life in America since, the first colonists landed here. And there are a number of things. I mean, first of all, I just want to say that, this is not a polemic about American relationship to violence. I mean, every country has violence in their history and their past, and it's unique to that country. And the United States is no different. So, there are a lot of interesting kind of pros and cons to our relationship to violence. I mean, we couldn't have freed ourselves from the crown without a violent revolution. We couldn't have ended the institution of slavery without a violent civil war. At the same time, we couldn't have got to the point of rebelling against the crown if we hadn't first subjugated a continent, and that required some violence. And we couldn't have freed the slaves in the Civil War without first embracing that institution for centuries, and that requires a level of violence, enforcement of slavery. So we have a complicated relationship with violence, and I think that understanding our gun violence problem today kind of requires embracing that background and understanding it, and it helps explain, why when you see gun industry marketing kind of bathed in images of heroics and patriotism and the flag and machismo, there's a reason for that, and it's a uniquely American reason. I think that to get to some of the psychological issues you're talking about, we see today gun industry marketing that is arguably irresponsible many times because it kind of plays upon some of the darker recesses of male psychology. There was advertising for Bushmaster AR-15 type rifles that directly appealed to what I'm talking about. And I'm going to actually quote you from part of this advertising campaign where they said, in a world of rapidly depleting testosterone, the Bushmaster man card declares and confirms you are a man's man.
Wow.
So, I mean, subtle as a brick, right? So that was basically, tied together with the marketing of an AR-15 rifle. That's the kind of rifle that was used in the Sandy Hook school massacre. In fact, the only reason we know about this kind of what was behind this kind of marketing is because of lawsuits that resulted from that massacre against the firearm manufacturer. So there's
Hmm.
a lot to unpack there, I know, but I think that, to get at some of the reasons for our current gun violence dilemma, you do have to sort of address that deeper, longer term issue of our relationship to guns and how complicated it is.
Hmm.
That's interesting because yeah, I was wondering. I was checking out the book and I was wondering why you had started with the Mystic Massacre versus the Revolutionary War, and then after hearing how you just responded, it actually makes sense to me because it really, of course, we were already using guns and for kind of conquering purposes versus to kind of liberate ourselves, which, came after with the Revolutionary War. And we always, when we refer to the history, we're essentially always referencing, like, no, this was how we got our freedom. This was how we defended ourselves from the corrupt government at the time. And then there's this like kind of identification with kind of this glory, heroism, and also just that general theme of freedom that people associate. But we've totally also have this other relationship that has to do with, yeah, like with conquering and um, expanding, taking territory, violence, and things of that nature.
Yeah, and one can also argue that it's
Yeah.
pretty much the identity with freedom and with liberation is actually just a cloak for pretty much for conquest and for domineering tendencies.
Yeah.
Well, it is interesting that the, discovery and settlement of the New World kind of dovetailed with the widespread adoption of firearms. Both our country and guns themselves have really not been around that long, in the grand sweep of human history. And so, by the time you get to the American Revolution and then afterwards, when they were putting together the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, what to do about guns and the ability to use them was front and center and much of that debate. And of course, I'm talking now about the Second Amendment and the issue of armed militias, which were key to the revolution in many ways. And it was really fascinating to research this area because, I mean, what you sort of know if you think about it, but you don't really think about it on a regular basis,
Hmm.
is that the Second Amendment was really kind of unique in the annals of history up to that point in time. I mean, there was no comparable model for the founders to look to on the world stage where you had, a uh, standing professional army that was answerable to the people through their elected representatives. There was nothing like that. So this is what, they were afraid of as a standing army being turned against the people. And so because there was no example of that working, they turned to the Second Amendment as a way of basically guarding against that existential threat.
Mm.
And the purpose of it, and I think it's pretty clear just from the writing, is it was intended to preserve the ability of people, citizens, to come together collectively in the form of a well-regulated militia. In this context, well-regulated means trained and disciplined, not necessarily restricted, in defense of the state. And there was no, you know, nothing in the Second Amendment that talks about self-defense. But this is not to say that the founders didn't believe that people didn't have a right to have a musket for self-defense or hunting or other purposes. It's just that it was the militia question which was existential. And if you look at the Bill of Rights, the other freedoms there are also intended to guard against existential threats.
Right.
And so, these other purposes for which people might have a gun, varmint shooting, self-defense, sport shooting, hunting, were not necessarily viewed in the same way. And what has happened over time, and specifically the last 50, 60 years, is the modern gun lobby kind of made it a project to change this interpretation of the Second Amendment so that it does protect an individual right to have a gun for non-militia purposes.
Hmm.
And this has been hugely controversial, and it really is at the root of why it's difficult now to regulate the use and possession of guns. Um, because, if something is governed by constitutional law, it is, as it should be, very, very difficult to regulate.
Right.
But if it's regulated by common law, then it's easier for legislatures to, impose limits. So this sort of issue of the Second Amendment, what the intent of it was, really is at the heart of so much of what of what the debate around guns is today.
Right. And how did it get stretched? So when did that happen, essentially, that it went from malicious to essentially the common person presenting it or using it to use it to protect themselves in their homes?
So for the better part of 2 centuries, it was viewed, when it was rarely ever taken up by the Supreme Court. It was a given that it was intended to preserve the ability of people to come together in the form of a militia.
Right.
Um, and I should point out, interestingly, at the time that the Second Amendment was being written, uh, the founders had a choice. I mean, they looked to state constitutions and declarations of independence at that time as potential models to when they were drafting the Bill of Rights. And there were some states, Pennsylvania and New Hampshire, I believe, or perhaps Vermont, that did have in their constitution the right to bear arms both for militia and self-defense.
Hmm.
And there were other states that did not. So the founders were aware of this, and they just chose not to include that, the self-defense part, just made it a militia-centric right. Over time, as I said earlier, and it was largely a project of the National Rifle Association, um, there was a gradual adoption of an alternative view that the Second Amendment was intended to preserve the right of individuals to bear arms for other lawful purposes.
Hmm.
This required a decades-long effort of cultivating and paying for scholarship, court cases, law reviews, all with the goal of kind of elevating a case up to the Supreme Court,
Mm.
which would eventually lock in this interpretation. And they got it with the Heller decision in 2008,
Hmm.
which was the first one ever to find this individual right in the Constitution for gun ownership, and it was drafted by Antonin Scalia.
Of course.
Um, there's a lot of debate, as I said, around his reasoning on this and legitimacy of some of the examples he chose. I always thought that one interesting uh, point of view was that of Warren Burger, a former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and a Republican, who once said that this attempt to kind of reframe the purpose and meaning of the Second Amendment was, in his words, the greatest fraud he had ever seen perpetrated on the American people in his lifetime.
Wow.
Mhm.
So, I mean, this is a former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. This is not me saying it.
Mm.
And yet, since Heller in 2008, the court has kept going in this direction and has, broadly expanded the rights of individuals to have guns for purposes that were, not really cited in the Second Amendment.
Mm.
Wow.
Then I have two questions. Since we brought up the founding fathers and the NRA and the role they played, I'll start with this first question though. I'm actually very curious. If you could ask James Madison, let's say, one question about, if you could ask him a question about his interpretation of the Second Amendment today, uh, what would that be? Yeah,
Um, interesting.
like
So,
how he would interpret it. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
so one thing that I think is interesting about Madison that a lot of people aren't aware of is he was not a lawyer. Many of the founders were, but he was not. So
Mm.
I point that out because so much of the debate today around interpreting the Second Amendment is being conducted by lawyers and judges and trying to place a modern day interpretation on what he might have been thinking. Um, I think there were two things that I think would be interesting actually to hear from him on. One is, as I was saying just a minute ago about how the NRA and the gun lobby in general kind of succeeded in reframing our view of the Second Amendment. A lot of this was driven by fear. There's a real element of that in gun industry marketing and in kind of telegraphing dark views of what the government may have in store for you and crime. A lot of that kind of drives um, gun rights in a direction that kind of got more extreme in the last 50 or 60 years. And Madison himself kind of faced some of this during the debates around the Bill of Rights. Um, During the Federalist debates, the anti-Federalists were concerned about this very issue, about preserving gun rights. They felt that the Bill of Rights and the Second Amendment, as it was shaping up, didn't go far enough in that. And they were, in Madison's view, they were sort of creating increasingly unrealistic scenarios of government oppression
Mm.
to try to justify their point of view. And he had a great quote from the Federalist Papers in response to this. He called this the exaggerations of a counterfeit zeal,
Hmm.
rather than the sober apprehensions of a genuine patriotism. And so basically,
Wow.
what he was saying was, enough with the phony outrage, because it's getting in the way of considering reasonable policies. I think that kind of gives a little bit of insight into his thinking on this.
Mm.
And I'd love to kind of, confirm that point of view in talking to him. I think one other thing I would be curious to hear him on is the Supreme Court, in trying to navigate modern day issues around gun policy, has created these tests to try to determine the legality of gun laws today and whether or not certain kinds of guns are protected by the Second Amendment. I
Hmm.
mean, of course, none of these can be found in the Constitution or in the Second Amendment. And one that comes to mind is one that just came up in the last couple of weeks, actually. The Supreme Court announced it was taking up in its next term the validity of assault weapons bans around the
Hmm.
country. I think it's very likely that they will wind up overturning those bans. But if they do, the reason for it probably will not be based on debates around public safety, but it'll be based on one of these tests that I'm talking about.
Mhm.
There's a rather arcane formula. It's called the common use test, and it's
Hmm.
basically used to determine whether or not a certain kind of gun is protected by the Second Amendment.
Hmm.
And it all hinges on whether or not, in this case, the AR-15 is considered to be in common use, basically meaning, do a lot of people have one? Is it popular? Do they like having one? And if so,
Mhm.
you can't ban it, and it's hard to restrict it. I think a lot of average Americans would be surprised by this, to find out that this is sort of what's driving and shaping gun policy as opposed to facts on the ground.
Yeah.
And I think that's the kind of thing that I think I'd love to hear from the founders as to what their views on that would have been.
Mm.
Wow. And the thing that I kind of struggle with just in general is because, or with, is essentially on the right, we have these people who are pretty much anti-corporation, anti kind of coastal elites, etc. And fundamentally, I mean, one can make the case that they're essentially being duped by these organizations, gun manufacturers, obviously the NRA, etc. Like these are conglomerates, right? So, I mean, Mike, from your kind of understanding, like how is it that they kind of fall for this, right? So on the one hand, you have this sort of sentiment of it's sort of anti-commercialism in some sense, unless it's like these kind of mom and pop stores. But on the other hand, I mean, they're essentially allowing Washington lobbyists to dictate their lives.
Um, I mean, one thing that the gun lobby and industry has been remarkably successful at is turning ownership of a gun into a cultural identifier. It
Hmm.
really is something that has fallen increasingly along political lines in the United States. It wasn't always this way. I mean, if you go back even as recently as the 1960s, you had people in Congress who pro-gun senators and representatives who were Democrats, almost in equal numbers to Republicans. John Dingell, who was a famously liberal, powerful Democrat from Michigan in the House, was probably the most, vociferous pro-Second Amendment guy for his term. I mean, that really doesn't exist today. A lot of it has been taken over by partisan politics. I think that, not to keep sort of, blowing air into the National Rifle Association more than we need to, but they really were remarkably successful in capturing the Republican Party,
Hmm.
um, politically, starting in really the 80s and kind of all the way through to the present. Um, and so I think a lot of it just boils down to partisan politics. It's a, it became, as I said, a cultural identifier, much in the same way that certain other hot button social issues have. This one just happens to be guns.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Um, but I think there's also kind of a mixed in with that. There is this sort of psychological cultural issue we were talking about earlier, that tends to just sort of be found more on the political right than it does on the left.
Hmm.
I don't necessarily think that average gun owners think of it in the terms that you were just describing, in the sense that they view the gun lobby or the industry as sort of this monolithic capitalistic enterprise that,
Hmm.
I just don't think it's viewed that way. I mean, from my discussions with gun owners, I'm a gun owner myself, actually. I think that it's different than other industries. It tends to, even though we, hear about the marketing often when something bad happens, um, it isn't as high profile as other types of things in our daily lives, in
Hmm.
terms of the industry itself. Um, and it is pretty fragmented, that it's not dominated by any giant company. And very few of them are publicly held, publicly traded. A lot of gun
Hmm.
companies are privately owned.
Hmm.
So it's kind of a curious animal, in terms of the business world. Economically, it's a little bit different than other things. And so I think it probably escapes that kind of scrutiny that you're alluding to.
Does it feel like for the average person that they would have access to it? So let's say if the person was like, "Hey, I want to someday, get a license and sell guns," I could hypothetically do it.
Yeah, I mean, you could apply for a federal gun dealer's license. I mean, the thing is, and this is one of the issues that gun safety advocates are concerned about, is you don't even need a license to sell guns in certain contexts.
Hmm.
For private sales, you can do that as long as you don't make a commercial business out of it.
Hmm.
You can sell
Wow.
guns privately with no license and also with no background checks.
Hmm.
So this has always been what's considered to be a loophole by gun violence prevention advocates, um, where a private sale could be conducted between two parties, no background check, as long as the gun doesn't cross state lines during the transaction. Nobody ever knows that happens, and there's no real, background uh, verification conducted of the person buying it. So that's unlikely to change, I think, given the current climate in Washington in terms of, gun laws in general, which are being eroded left and right, really, because of the Trump administration's support for what they view as Second Amendment rights.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do you think that in order for there to be change around regulation, do you think that it would be better if it came more from, if, like, let's say there was a cultural shift in terms of how we regarded guns, whether it was in our media or how we discussed them? Do you think like it's something that would come from kind of the ground up, or it's probably better to aim for, no, let's just aim for that regulation, and then from top down, essentially that'll change the behavior over time?
Mm.
I know how general that sounds, and yeah, but
Yeah, no, I hear what you're saying. I mean, first of all, I should point out that, I mean, I have to remind you, I'm a journalist, and so I kind of
of course.
approach this issue objectively in the sense that I try to look at the facts and do my reporting, and all with the knowledge. I'm also, as I said, I'm a gun owner myself, and I was raised in a family of cops and veterans and outdoorsmen who are familiar with guns. So I only raise that just to make the point that, I mean, a lot of gun owners and pro-gun rights people would say there is no need to change anything.
Mm.
That reform is not necessary because everything's okay. But I think that for people who do want to see something done to try to change the current state of affairs, um, and I get into this in my book a little bit. Um, it's a tough road right now because largely because of the Supreme Court and the interpretation of the Second Amendment. At the end of the day, any attempt in Congress or at the state level to pass a gun law is going to run afoul of these roadblocks set up by the Supreme Court in a series of recent decisions, not just Heller, but there are ones after that. And until that changes, until the interpretation of the Second Amendment and the various tests that kind of flowed out of this change, it's pretty hard, to envision uh, the landscape of gun rights right now being altered in any kind of meaningful way.
Mm.
And as I say in the book, I mean, I make the point that I think one model that gun violence prevention advocates could look to is the NRA itself. They succeeded, over a very long period of time, in a long-range plan to basically change the legal interpretation, the legal landscape around guns, and the cultural landscape around guns. And they succeeded, I think, probably beyond their wildest dreams. But that took a generation, basically. That started in the 1970s and really kind of reached an apotheosis in the 2000s.
Mm-hmm.
But there's no reason why, I mean, another long-term effort pointed in the other direction, to kind of return to where former Chief Justice Berger says this, Second Amendment needs to be.
Right.
Uh, couldn't do the same thing, but it's not going to happen overnight.
Yeah, and there's also, I think, just going back into the psychology of things, I think there's also this sense, and for a lot of, I want to talk about the masculinity, if you want to call it a crisis. So I think for a lot of men, and honestly, I mean, this is probably true more broadly for a lot of people, but I think for a lot of men, they fear being ordinary. So for, as you say in the book, right? Because in this case, I'm not saying anything original here, but like in the book, you essentially mentioned that. So for men, the guns pretty much offer a path, at least kind of ideally, or at the very least hypothetically, to glory, right? So the way these kind of companies, let's say, market guns and sort of other materials like vests or whatever else, they pretty much it's a replica of pretty much like army gear, right? For a lot of it, and it's kind of shown in movies, and there's this sense of like I could kind of become the hero, et cetera, right? And I find that for a lot of people, that's really, and I'm sure you obviously would agree based on your book, for a lot of people, especially a lot of men, again, like this is super important to them. So it's important for them not to be average, to differentiate themselves. And I think for a lot of people, especially when they're living in isolated areas, and let's say they kind of contrast themselves to people in, obviously, let's say on, let's say, the coasts or whatever, right? And they would say, well, we don't want to be like those feminized men, right? So those are like the kind of pussies or whatever, the cowards, right? It's a very kind of like let's say black and white mentality of like, obviously we're better than them, but also like we're the real heroes, right? So we're the type of men that women would want, essentially. So my thinking here is that when you're thinking about sort of maybe not repurposing, but kind of commercializing, or kind of sort of changing the kind of marketing around it. Essentially, what we would have to do is we would have to kind of like deglorify these instruments, right? Essentially, you said, kind of going into the past, that if guns were pretty much used by huntsmen, they were essentially used for protection, obviously by the military, etc. And then the common person said that I could kind of be like this, and you see this exemplified in film, right? So would you say essentially that we kind of have to get to the heart of this and find a way for men to feel, maybe not like heroes, but at least some sense of glory or some sense of strength, maybe better yet, away from guns, to say like, okay, you can still feel like, if that's important to you, not like an average person, or like you're really important in your community, that you exhibit and exude strength, but there are other ways of doing this outside of this.
Yeah, I mean, I think you get to a very interesting and challenging issue, and I think it's most prevalent and important to address around young men, older teenagers and men in their 20s. Um, if you look at who it is who's perpetrating gun violence, it's mostly young men. Um, and there's a number of reasons for that. A lot of it, I think, does have to do with the issues that you're talking about. The marketing is sort of aimed at kind of what is viewed as sort of a weak spot, in the psychology of young men. And I do think that, um, when you begin to kind of focus on that, there are a number of disturbing things that have little to do with guns themselves, but have a broader, more broadly, have to do with, alienation of young men. And this, of course, is not a new thought. I mean, this has been well covered in the media. Um, but we where it dovetails with gun policy, we see what the results can be. And just to give two recent examples, like in the last 10 years, both Salvatore Ramos in Uvalde, Texas, and Nicholas Cruz in Parkland, Florida, were troubled young men, teenagers, alienated, angry at girls, loners, and they both waited until they were 18 in their respective states, Florida and Texas, when they could legally purchase an AR-15 type rifle. Salvatore Ramos went online and ordered it, and then wound up, of course, massacring little kids at Uvalde Elementary. And Nicholas Cruz, same thing at Parkland. So, I mean, here you have two examples of alienated, troubled, late teenage young men, boys, um, who I think are probably susceptible to the kind of marketing and the kind of um, pitch that you're getting at here in terms of, they're looking for some way to kind of make themselves feel powerful and in control. Um, and, not to keep quoting the Bushmaster ad, but to be back on top, have your man
Right.
card reissued.
Right.
And yeah, I think that when you combine that, with the easy availability of firearms in this case, I mean, the fact an 18-year-old could go and can buy one of these weapons, what if the age minimum had been 21? Both of those cases, we don't know what maybe things could have been different. But yeah, I think that that is a core problem with a lot of what drives gun violence. And I don't know, I don't pretend to know what the solution to that is. A lot of it has little to do with guns and more to do with just, addressing this broader issue of alienation of young males in American culture.
Right. And just returning to just the psychology of things. I mean, I want to kind of mention a movie, because I just think it was a good movie. I'm not going to get into like the depths of it or whatnot. But like, so just going into the concept of ordinariness. So, Mike, have you seen the movie The Drama?
I have not.
Okay, so the premise, I'm gonna kind of spoil it for people just because it's already been out there. So essentially, the premise was that Emma, the Zendaya character, so she essentially was gonna shoot up a high school at some point. So that's pretty much like the big reveal. Everybody finds out like, oh my God, she actually planned to shoot up a high school. And so like as the story progresses, there's a lot of kind of going back and forth of why she did it and what the motives were, etc., etc. The point was to say that like she didn't really know, but fundamentally she was alienated, she was bullied. She created these videos where she essentially said, "I'm gonna kind of show them, I'm gonna be on top." etc., etc., right? And then at some point, what ends up happening is things just kind of randomly change. So at some point, she just kind of changes her mind, even though there's like this incident that stops her. Fundamentally, she doesn't follow through with it. So what happens is she ends up changing her mind. So she kind of starts to feel a little bit more accepted by people. A few things happen, right? So she changes a little bit, people change a little bit. She actually then becomes a anti-gun. Well, I don't want to call it anti-gun, but anti-machine gun activist, right? Not anti-gun per se. But the point is to say that little by little, she feels, kind of a deeper part of the community. And so I think the lesson that you learn from it, from the perspective of a teenager, right? And, in this case, I'm kind of more or less surmising here, but I think it's more or less accurate also. But I would say for somebody like her, the reason why it seems, as again, the story progresses, that she needed to feel superior is because she felt and she blamed other people for making her inferior. So I think when we look at the concept of ordinariness, right, it only becomes repugnant when it feels like your only choices are rejection or obviously, superiority. It doesn't actually feel like ordinariness is possible for you. So
Mhm.
I feel like for a lot of these young men, they don't essentially feel like being ordinary, whatever that even is, but they don't feel like that's accessible to them. So their only choices are either, I'm kind of bullied or I'm the one in control and I'm kind of taking over. And that's sort of what you get from the Zendaya character. She didn't feel like until the point where she was more or less accepted, like that was a part or that was possible for her. So I guess I just wonder, and Mike, it's okay, obviously, if this is sort of beyond the scope of what you do or what you write about, but I am curious. So in terms of if you had any thoughts about this, I wonder what will we do to get boys to, first of all, and especially obviously younger boys, to feel like A, they can be accepted, and B, that acceptance is actually worthy, right? That you don't have to be glorified, you don't have to be a hero, and you don't have to especially be a hero for your life to matter.
Well, yeah, that's a tall order. But I mean, look, I mean, I have three kids, two girls and a boy. They're all adults now. And my son, was raised in Boy Scouts. He went to Scouts and I think I mentioned that only because that kind of activity was something that really instilled a lot of self-confidence in him and a lot of positive things. I mean, I just think in general there are plenty of things that could be done to instill, a sense of belonging and a sense of self-worth and confidence that would probably obviate some of these issues that we're talking about. I mean, this does get into a whole area of like, the toxic effects of social media, which because of the endless, studies and news reporting done on this. Um, the one thing I would say about what you mentioned in the movie, the only thing which is a little bit at odds with the norm is that in as you said, it was a girl, it was a
Yeah.
female who was. That is quite rare
Right.
in the sort of the realm of like, when we think of mass shooters or people who are committing gun crimes. Um, and which I think again goes back to like just what the core of the problem is. It is young men who are really, not just mass shooters, but also just street crimes, gang violence. And yeah, there are some tall questions there, which have nothing to do with guns, but have to do with sort of getting at the root cause of why there is this sort of epidemic of loneliness and alienation and lack of self-confidence. And it gets into so many different questions I don't feel qualified to talk about. But and yet, it is all part and parcel of sort of this larger problem that is the subject of our discussion here.
So,
No, absolutely. Plus, honestly, anyway, when I think about all of the influences I've ever had in my life, going from movies to video games. Yeah, guns are very hard to get away from, right? I mean, as far as like the Call of Duty games or kids these days playing, let's say Fortnite or whatever, Valorant, whatever kind of games. Uh, yeah, they kind of make shooting, guns look fun. I'm not gonna lie, I enjoy it myself too. I'm not a gun owner, but I've been to a gun range before, and it felt cool to to shoot a 50 caliber rifle, just to kind of feel like what is that, the recoil from that feel like and all of that. Somebody who's actually into guns would hear me saying it's like, this guy doesn't really know what he's talking about, but at least, it was interesting, you know.
Hmm.
And I've heard all of the different kinds of arguments too, from like whether it's radio personalities or podcast personalities. I've heard pro-gun sort of arguments, anti-gun arguments, and I don't know. I mean, not that but we're trying to be objective here, right? Of course, but honestly, I think it's probably okay to own a gun. As far as like what kind of guns, we could start to get into that conversation, like the AR-15. What age should you be? How should you keep them? How should you store them? How do you, like these kinds of laws? Like there should be some kind of maybe common sense sort of law. Um, but then, yeah, you hear some of the arguments that, let's say, people on the right use. Let's say, like, okay, we have the right to bear arms, and also we want maybe freedom from government regulation in case the government gets out of hand, right? But then it's funny, you don't think about the other side of like, what about other kinds of freedom, like the freedom to not live in fear of maybe a potential, mass shooting at your school, or maybe this is harder to get around, but like maybe like a home invasion or like a criminal trying to rob you at gunpoint. That's harder because they're probably getting their guns. I mean, they could get it legally, but they might be just getting it illegally as well. And so then regulating guns doesn't really protect you from those people who still get it illegally. So it's
Hmm.
a very hard conversation. I
Yeah.
guess I'm just kind of
Well, so Mike,
stream of
can we
conscious.
actually
Yeah.
then get into the
Yeah.
main philosophies or the competing philosophies involved?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, and so I think that you were touching on an issue that is one that is sort of at the heart of much of the debate. It really is, it's the guns themselves in many ways. And, like you're mentioning violent video games. Um, yeah, I mean, my son liked them too. Um, and every developed nation on earth has a lot of the same issues that we do with crime, mental health, certainly video games. That's not unique to the United States. And yet, we alone seem to have this problem where school kids, grocery shoppers, churchgoers are murdered on a regular basis with guns.
Hmm.
And we alone also have an environment where, you know, you have easy availability and at times arguably reckless marketing of firearms. And when you think about that, it kind of is not surprising then that, 75 to 80% of all homicides in the US are committed with firearms. And in recent years, around 40,000 people a year, half of them suicides, have been killed with firearms, and guns are the leading cause of death for children and teens. So, this is what sort of makes America stand out from the rest of the world when we talk about all these various problems. These other countries don't have the same gun violence problem that we do, even though they have a lot of the same sociological, cultural issues that we do. So when you look at it that way, you do kind of have to question whether or not the easy availability and access of guns isn't part of what's happening here.
Hmm.
There are more guns than people in the United States, in the civilian population. And we reached a point where just, ringing the wrong doorbell by mistake or pulling into the wrong
Right.
driveway can get you shot.
Right.
Hmm.
So, I mean, you can't blame video games on that, really. And, or even marketing. It just seems like, I think gun safety prevention advocates point to this and say, a big part of the problem is just we have too many guns. They're too easy to get. And that's one argument. So, and I think that does sort of get at the the bookends of this debate. You do have people on one side saying, well, it doesn't matter how many guns we have. It's not the gun that's the problem. It's the person.
Hmm.
And then the other side is saying, well, of course it's the person, but it's also too many guns.
Mm,
The wrong people are too easily able to get guns.
mhm.
And so far, it's almost been impossible in recent times for those two sides to really kind of meet in the middle on anything that can resemble a compromise.
Right. Right. So I want to ask kind of a tough question. So in terms of let's say the Second Amendment and just, pro guns advocates. So what would we do or what would we say if somebody were to say, well, like that's fine, but we don't really actually care that much about the Constitution, like whatever it allows. Essentially, as a community, we got together and we think guns are good and we want to be responsible for them, and it's not our problem whether other people are or aren't. This is just about us. So whether, let's say the founding fathers had this in mind or whether they wanted to arm militias, that has nothing to do with the way we live now. We are responsible gun owners. That's as you said, that's a part of our identity. And personally, we want it to be our legal right to continue to carry arms.
Well, I mean, I guess the counter argument would be the same on the other side, right? If we're going to ignore constitutional intent, the text and history of the Second Amendment, to benefit one side, you could do the same thing from the other point of view as well. I think that right now, gun owners and gun rights advocates have the Second Amendment and the Constitution at their back, in their corner, thanks to
Mm-hmm.
the Supreme Court.
Mm-hmm.
So they probably would not actually reject the idea that the text and history of the Constitution should be ignored because right now the interpretation benefits them.
Hmm.
I think gun safety prevention advocates would be wanting to try to return to a different view of the Second Amendment and the Constitution that would benefit their perspective. And sort of therein lies, kind of the battle lines, if you will, politically, ideologically, legally. Um, and it's kind of hard to see right now where things are going to change much. I mean, the gun lobby has really succeeded, as I said earlier, amazingly well in sort of gaining traction and changing the way that we look at gun laws and the culture around guns. And I just think that it's likely to remain the status quo probably for quite some time.
Wow.
Mm.
Yeah, and you mentioned in the book that there's a sense of an existential threat. So can you speak a little bit about that? So essentially, your argument is that common sense reform is precluded or prevented just by the simple fact that, let's say, the NRA feels threatened, gun owners feel threatened. Essentially, they think of it in black and white and all or nothing terms.
Yeah, I mean, there seems to be little appetite or room for compromise on this, which by itself is not entirely new. I mean, this is something that's been developing, I think, since the 1970s. A lot of it was driven by the gun lobby doubling down on a more radical view of gun rights. This was largely a blowback from the gun control efforts of the 1960s, where you had political assassinations, you had a lot of street violence and chaos, and kind of a view that a perception things were unraveling. And um, that was answered by the Gun Control Act of 1968, which was really one of only two times in American history where they had a major federal law aimed at regulating the possession and use of firearms. And that really galvanized the gun lobby in a way that hadn't been up to that point. And to really double down on this effort to not just push back and try to beat down efforts to pass gun laws, but to just win the longer term argument, about the Second Amendment and gun rights in America. And once they launched down that path, I think that really kind of defined the battle lines going forward, and that really hasn't changed. It's only gotten more difficult and extreme ever since. So, they really kind of went to war, politically, ideologically, culturally. And as we were saying earlier, it became a much more partisan debate. The NRA would ruthlessly enforce its, campaign uh, tests for politicians, whether they agreed with, an increasingly extreme version of gun rights or not.
Right.
And so, I mean, really, it's been something that's been building for quite some time. Um, And it's hard to sort of envision what it would take right now at this moment to change that in any quick way.
Wow. So,
No,
so
go ahead.
So, how much of it actually is then based on government mistrust? Because I assume, I mean, maybe I'm wrong about this, but I think if you look at the data, I assume gun sales, like for the most part, I'm sure they fluctuate a little bit, but I'm assuming they remain pretty steady across administration. So, how much of it is actually then based on government mistrust, like realistically?
Well, it's interesting you say that because you can actually look at certain moments in recent history where the fear of gun confiscation drove gun sales.
Mm,
And the biggest, best example of that is during the Obama administration.
mm,
The NRA and the gun lobby, really worked all out to scare people into thinking that Obama's coming for your guns.
mm,
And you can look at gun sales during that period, and they went straight up. And it really was in response to this perceived threat that was really kind of ginned up in many ways by politicians and the gun lobby.
mm,
So I mean, you can see different points in time where, in response, for instance, to a really bad mass shooting, you would get this almost perverse reaction where people will buy up assault weapons because they're afraid that bans are going to kick in after a mass shooting.
mm,
You see spikes in sales after that when these things happen. Um, yeah, I mean, I think that the politics of gun regulation does in some interesting and strange ways kind of drive some of the firearms economy. Um, but in recent years, since Trump became president in 2016 and then again in 2024, you often see kind of a, a, a counter reaction where there's a feeling of, well, things are okay now if you're a gun rights proponent, and you don't necessarily see as much interest in buying more guns because there's a feeling like we don't really need to, because
mm.
we've kind of, which is kind of interesting. It's like it's a
Yeah,
little bit counterintuitive, but you do
yeah.
see that in times when um, it's not viewed as sort of an existential threat to owning a gun, and so that nobody feels the need to rush out and buy one.
Oh wow, because I would have actually thought the opposite. Would let's say, as an example, with the Trump administration, I would think people would think that because restrictions are looser, or at least the perception of them is, now is like the time to go up and stockpile.
I mean, there's a feeling that the stockpiling usually happens when people are afraid that restrictions are coming, that they're
Mm,
they're coming down the pike. The Congress is going to pass a law. My state's going to ban AR-15s, and then you see the stockpiling. But right, you don't really get that as much when there's not that sort of like external threat.
gotcha.
Hmm. I'm curious if this. So I know in the book you are mainly being objective, not necessarily, going for one side or another, or putting an opinion. But just out of curiosity, if let's say a preferred policy, let's say of yours as a gun owner, could be passed tomorrow, what policy would you like to see passed?
Yeah, I mean, it does kind of get into an area where I do have to kind of maintain my journalistic objectivity. I mean, I do
Fair,
have personal
fair.
views. I have personal views about,
Yeah.
like we all do, about everything. Um, and I did point out in the book my own experiences as a gun owner and also growing up in a family with guns and also as a journalist, covering gun violence and gun issues because I think those are kind of helpful in informing some of my reporting and how I view these things as a reporter. Um, so, I think I'm a little bit limited as to what I could say to that. It's probably not my role to kind of vouch for one policy or another. It's funny though, because I mean, I do mention, yeah, I own guns, but I think gun rights advocates would view me as what they call a FUD,
Mm,
which is short for Elmer Fudd, the cartoon
mm,
character who used to have a shotgun.
mm,
Because I don't have an AR-15 type rifle, and therefore I'm a wimp, in their view.
Hmm.
So I bring up the issue of my own gun ownership, not to try to pretend like I'm an expert on guns, but just to point out that, look, I mean, a lot of average people have guns and don't make them central to their identities. Try to be responsible in terms of, keeping it at home, keeping it away from kids, all of that sort of thing. Not idolizing them or fetishizing it. And I think that probably speaks to some of what you're getting at. I mean, that's sort of how I handle my situation as a gun owner. To the extent that I think that kind of gets at what you're getting at, I think that's what I try to do in the book.
Mm.
No, no.
And so one of our final questions is going to be in terms of the messaging, right? So I can just quickly as an anecdote. So I remember as a child, I was actually a huge fan, which is funny because like me and Alan still joke about this. I was a huge fan of the Lethal Weapon series. So
Mhm.
like I didn't know much about guns. I mean, I kind of just thought they were cool or whatever, right? So for anybody who knows, Lethal Weapon 3 was actually kind of an advocacy, or the movie was like, I don't want to say it was exactly an advocacy, but whatever. But the message essentially, like, I don't know, maybe it was kind of the main purpose, whatever. I don't want to guess. But the point is to say, like, there was kind of an advocacy component to it. So essentially, what happens in the story is, so Nick, who's one of the guys, like, so he's Danny Glover's son in the movie. His friend essentially gets killed by gun violence, and so the purpose of the film is to show that, like, obviously guns are bad, and they can be lethal, etc. And then so there's this great scene in the movie where like Danny Glover tells him, like, dude, like, Roger Murtaugh, and he tells him, like, dude, like this killed your friend, right? And so like you have to stay away from this, man. He's like, I get it. He's like, I understand that people think it's protection, etc. But these are really, for the most part, for the untrained, human or whatever. Like these are really bad. And so you're looking at this, from obviously for me, like from the perspective of a child, and I'm learning about it, and I'm thinking like, wow, like here's this cop on screen who's saying like, hey man, like these things should really be in the hands of a very few people, right? And I think the message, again, for me as a child, I don't know how much it impacted an adult, but for me as a child, that was super important because for me, obviously, who played with toy guns, watched Schwarzenegger and Stallone movies or whatever, right? I got the sense of like, oh shit, like wow, this is really something you have to be sincerely and significantly careful with. So I wonder for you, Mike, like how much do you think is, whether it's Hollywood or whatever else, even just podcasting or whatever else, how important do you think is counter messaging here?
Well, I think that, certainly in terms of, as you were describing, how you absorb this information as a kid, is important. And I think if you look around the landscape of, gun influencers on TikTok and Instagram and YouTube today, it's really dominated by, people who are promoting it in the way that we were discussing earlier, as this whole like answer to, being a man. And a lot of this kind of exaggerated, views of characteristics of masculinity. I mean, some of it's kind of silly, you kind of laugh at it. But yeah, I mean, to the extent that that's how some kids, especially boys, maybe kind of absorbing, for the first time, the idea of what it is to have a gun and what the purpose of it is and why you should have one and what it should be used for. I think, all those things can be kind of concerning to some people. I think it's always important to have a positive, responsible role model in your own life when it comes to something like this. I mean, speaking for myself, as my own experience as a gun owner, when I was raised as a kid, yes, I had, toy guns, tons of them. I was exposed to, the popularity of guns and comic books and cartoons and, movies. But I also had a father who was a gun owner and taught me how to respect it, and to be careful with it. And it wasn't a toy,
Mhm.
even though, as I point out in the book, when my parents weren't around, I sometimes did find the gun and take it out and did treat it as a toy, which I think sort of gets at kind of the a problem. I wouldn't say a problem, but just sort of a unique characteristic of young boys, of young males, is there is a magnetic attraction to guns, and it's hard to know how much of that's cultural, how much of it's psychological, but it's there. So, but my point is, the larger point is, I mean, yeah, I think that all of these things help shape, you know, um, young person's view of what's a responsible way to use a gun. And I think it is potentially risky when you have people who, are making a living on the web, online, kind of promoting a view of guns as just sort of basically toys, something to have fun with, to blast away at, and sort of like not without much thought given to, the being safe with them, and who should have one and for what purpose.
Right. Yeah, and I think what made it so important for me is that because at the time I would look at like the characters, obviously Martin Riggs and Murtaugh. So essentially, I would look at them as kind of like authority figures, obviously people who I idealize and idolize. And so for me to hear that, I was thinking like, okay, like these are people, the lethal weapons or whatever. So these are essentially people who kind of like, what's the word? I mean, not only just know what they're talking about, but essentially they're sort of telling you, kind of what's best or what's right, right? So it's like fundamentally, I think what we're saying is that the messaging also has to come from people that we initially respect. So, I mean, this is probably the hard part, right? So, getting maybe some of these people who are kind of pro gun advocates, hopefully, I think the idea is to get them to change their minds because I think pretty much like if you have some pundit on CNN or whatever arguing against it, I don't think that that's going to reach the kid or the average kid, at least who's pro gun. So, what I'm pretty much saying is that when you have something like a Lethal Weapon, right? I already started with Lethal Weapon 1 and Lethal Weapon 2, so I already had a deep admiration for the characters. So, for Richard Donner, the director of the film, for him to turn it and to say, hey, I know we made guns look cool in the first two movies, but now we're actually going to have kind of a more restrained or a hesitant view of them. Right now, I'm like, oh shit, now I changed my mind because it comes from these people. So I would argue essentially we need something more like that.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah.
All right, man. So final questions for Mike before we wrap up, man.
Yes, if we wanted to follow you, follow your work, and of course buy the book, where can we do that?
Well, so I'm a reporter at the New York Times, and my work is collected there. And the book is by through Simon Schuster. It's coming out on July 21st, and hopefully it will be available at any bookstore online.
Mike, thank you
Awesome.
so much, man. This was
This is
so
great.
illuminating.
Yeah.
This has been great. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely, man. We'll talk to you soon.
Take
All
care.
right, take care. Thanks.
Bye.
All right. Awesome. So, everyone, of course, as you know, you can follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Facebook and on Instagram. On X, we're at Seize underscore podcast. Like, subscribe, hit the bell on YouTube. And again, thank you so much for watching and see you next time.